All right, so these are going to be my notes from Chapter 4 of the 11th edition of How to Think Straight About Psychology by Keith Stanovich. And most of these notes are directly from the book. They are the sections that I thought were the most important. And these notes are meant as a study guide, not as a substitute for actually reading the book. You should still read the book. Okay, so Chapter 4, Testimonials and Case Study Evidence, Placebo Effects, and the Amazing Randy. And I'm going to read the Chapter 4 summary again, which again is usually at the end of the chapter, or it is at the end of the chapter, but I like to read it at the beginning and at the end of the notes. So the Chapter 4 summary, Case study and testimonial evidence is useful in psychology and other sciences in the very earliest stages of an investigation, when it is important to find interesting phenomena and important variables to examine further. As useful as case study evidence is in the early pre-theoretical stages of scientific investigation, it is virtually useless in the later stages, when theories are being put to specific tests. This is because, as an isolated phenomenon, the outcome of a case study leaves many alternative explanations. One way to understand why case studies and testimonial evidence are useless for theory testing is to consider the placebo effect. The placebo effect is the tendency of people to report that any treatment has helped them, regardless of whether the treatment had a real therapeutic element. The existence of placebo effects makes it impossible to prove the effectiveness of a psychological or medical treatment by producing testimonials to its effectiveness. The reason is that the placebo effect guarantees that no matter what the treatment, it will be possible to produce testimonial evidence to its effectiveness. Despite the uselessness of testimonial evidence in theory testing, psychological research has indicated that such evidence is often weighted quite heavily by people because of the vividness effect. People overweigh evidence that is more vivid and hence more retrievable from memory. One thing that is particularly vivid for most people is testimonial evidence. This result is an over-reliance on such evidence in the justification of specific psychological claims. In fact, testimonial and case study evidence cannot be used to justify general theoretical claims. So the section before 4.1 begins. Case studies and testimonials are virtually worthless as evidence for the evaluation of psychological theories and treatments. Section 4.1, the place of the case study. Definition of case study. A case study is an investigation that looks intensely and in detail at a single individual or very small number of individuals. The usefulness of case study information is strongly determined by how far scientific investigation has advanced in a particular area. The insights gained from case studies or clinical experience may be quite useful in the early stages of the investigation of certain problems as indicators of which variables deserve more intense study. Case studies have played a prominent role in opening up new areas of study in psychology. Well-known examples of case studies opening up new areas of study in psychology occur in the work of Jean Piaget. Piaget's investigations raised the possibility that children's thinking is not just a watered-down or degraded version of adults' thinking, but has a structure of its own. Some of Piaget's conjectures about children's thinking have been confirmed, but many have not. However, what is important for our discussion here is not how many of Piaget's conjectures have been confirmed. Instead, what is important is to understand the fact that Piaget's case studies did not prove anything, but rather suggested incredibly fruitful areas for developmental psychologists to investigate. It was subsequent correlational and experimental studies of the type to be described in Chapter 5 and 6 that provided the confirmatory and disconfirmatory evidence for the hypotheses that were generated by Piaget's case studies. When we move from the early stages of scientific investigation, where case studies may be very useful, to the more mature stages of theory testing, the situation changes drastically. Case studies are not useful at the later stages of scientific investigation because they cannot be used as confirming or disconfirming evidence in the test of a particular theory. The reason is that case studies and testimonials are isolated events that lack the comparative information necessary to rule out alternative explanations. One of the limitations of Freud's work was that he never took the second step of moving from interesting hypotheses based on case studies to actually testing those hypotheses. One of the leading writers about Freud's work, Frank Soloway, has said that, quote, "Science is a two-step process. The first step is the development of hypotheses. Freud had developed a set of extremely compelling, extremely plausible hypotheses for his day, but he never took that key second procedural step in the rigorous manner that is required for true science," end quote. The goal of experimental design is to structure events so that support of one particular explanation simultaneously disconfirms other explanations. Data collection as support for a particular theory must not leave many other alternative explanations as equally viable candidates. For this reason, scientists construct control or comparison groups in their experimentation. Control groups are formed so that, when their results are compared with those from an experimental group, some alternative explanations are ruled out. Section 4.2. Why testimonials are worthless. Placebo effects. Virtually every therapy that has ever been devised in medicine and psychology has governed supporters and has been able to produce individuals who will testify sincerely to its efficacy. The tendency of people to report that any treatment has helped them, regardless of whether it has a real therapeutic element, is known as the placebo effect. The placebo effect has been found to be 29% of patients reporting satisfactory relief after receiving a placebo for major depression, 36% for a duodenal ulcer, 29% for migraine headache, and 27% for reflux esophagitis. Finally, even so-called open-label placebos have been found to work for lower back pain. An open-label placebo situation is one where people are told they are getting a placebo. Placebo effects can be modulated by the context of expectation. Research has demonstrated that a costly placebo provides more pain relief than a cheap placebo. 50% of physicians report that they deliberately prescribe placebos. Of course, in actual research on drug therapies, the placebo control is not a pill containing nothing, but instead is one containing the best currently known agent for the condition. The issue, isolated by the experimental comparison, is whether the new drug is superior to the best one currently available. Many people with psychological problems of mild to moderate severity report improvement after receiving psychotherapy. However, controlled studies have demonstrated that some proportion of this recovery rate is due to a combination of placebo effects and the mere passage of time. Spontaneous remission. Spontaneous remission is when a person receiving psychotherapy for a psychological problem has their problem resolved as a result of passage of time, not the psychotherapy. Most therapeutic treatments are some unknown combination of an active therapeutic component and a placebo effect. In studies of psychotherapy effectiveness, it is often difficult to determine exactly how to treat the placebo control group. Research has shown that psychotherapies do have a positive effect over and above what would be expected purely as the result of a placebo. But experiments using placebo controls have demonstrated that merely citing the overall percentage of people who report improvement vastly overestimates the degree of improvement that is uniquely due to the particular treatment. Placebo effects are potentially occurring whenever a therapeutic intervention is undertaken, regardless of the efficacy of the intervention. The problem is that placebo effects are so potent that, no matter how ludicrous the therapy one uses, if it is administered to a large group of people, a few will be willing to give a testimonial to its efficacy. Section 4.3. The vividness problem. The vividness effect. When faced with a problem-solving or decision-making situation, people retrieve from memory the information that seems relevant to the situation at hand. Thus, they are more likely to use the facts that are accessible to solve a problem or make a decision. One factor that strongly affects accessibility is the vividness of information. The problem is that there is nothing more vivid or compelling than sincere personal testimony that something has occurred or that something is true. The vividness of personal testimony often overshadows other information of much higher reliability. People worry more about plane crashes than car crashes because plane crashes are much more vivid in the way they are portrayed in media, even though car crashes are much more common. This is the vividness problem, also known as the vividness effect. Cornell University has a reputation for having a high suicide rate, yet its suicide rate is below the national average. The reason why it has this reputation is because the way people commit suicide is by jumping off very high bridges into deep glaciated forests. And after suicides occur, there are traffic tie-ups and a lot of TV coverage. In this situation, it is the vividness effect that gives Cornell its reputation for having a higher suicide rate. Another example of the vividness effect. Several studies have shown that the conclusions of scientific experiments in cognitive neuroscience were rated as more credible if they contained a brain image summarizing the results instead of a graph depicting the identical outcome. Anecdotal information tends to be weighted too highly by people because of its vividness. Vivid anecdotal evidence will prevent people from making choices that are backed by real supporting evidence. In the Vietnam War, between 200 and 300 American soldiers died every week. It wasn't until pictures of the dead soldiers were published in a magazine that there was a national uproar. Nothing changed except the vividness of the display of the same information. Decades of research in cognitive psychology has shown that humans are so-called cognitive misers because our natural default is to use the least taxing mental processes, called type 2 processes, when approaching a problem. When we evaluate a personal opinion, we automatically engage the evolutionary old regions of the brain having to do with social engagement. In contrast, understanding scientific evidence, which involves more complex strategic and logical thinking, is a more recent cultural achievement and requires slow and mentally taxing type 2 processing. Even if a person can evaluate scientific evidence, the miserly tendency to default to type 1 processing may still lead some people to ignore scientific reasoning in the face of a more emotionally persuasive personal opinion. Scientific and statistical thinking can be practiced to the point of automaticity whereby they themselves become a less taxing mental option. P.T. Barnum effect, or just Barnum effect. The P.T. Barnum effect has been studied extensively by psychologists. The effect is, the vast majority of individuals will endorse generalized personality summaries as accurate or specific descriptions of themselves. The Barnum effect is, of course, the basis of belief in the accuracy of palm readers and astrologists. Section 4.4. Testimonials open the door to pseudoscience. It is sadly true that universities themselves are no guarantee of quality control. Many university courses are full of pseudoscientific information, and many courses, indeed sometimes entire departments and universities, are explicitly anti-science in their approach. Not all courses in psychology departments adhere to the principles articulated in this book. Some university departments are more engaged in political advocacy than they are true inquiry. Outside of the STEM disciplines, there is no guarantee that your university instructors are actually demonstrating scientific thinking styles. Chapter 4 summary again. Case study and testimonial evidence is useful in psychology and other sciences in the very earliest stages of an investigation when it is important to find interesting phenomena and important variables to examine further. As useful as case study evidence is in the early pre-theoretical stages of scientific investigation, it is virtually useless in the later stages when theories are being put to specific tests. This is because, as an isolated phenomenon, the outcome of a case study leaves many alternative explanations. One way to understand why case studies and testimonial evidence are useless for theory testing is to consider the placebo effect. The placebo effect is the tendency of people to report that any treatment has helped them, regardless of whether the treatment had a real therapeutic element. The existence of placebo effects makes it impossible to prove the effectiveness of a psychological or medical treatment by producing testimonials to its effectiveness. The reason is that the placebo effect guarantees that no matter what the treatment, it will be possible to produce testimonial evidence to its effectiveness. Despite the uselessness of testimonial evidence and theory testing, psychological research has indicated that such evidence is often weighted quite heavily by people because of the vividness effect. People overweigh evidence that is more vivid and hence more retrievable from memory. One thing that is particularly vivid for most people is testimonial evidence. The result is an over-reliance on such evidence in the justification of specific psychological claims. In fact, testimonial and case study evidence cannot be used to justify general theoretical claims.